The numbers don't lie. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee, the way it always did on Sunday mornings when Margaret stirred her famous apple cake batter. At 72, her hands moved with the practiced precision of decades, measuring flour by feel rather than sight. The morning sun streamed through gingham curtains, casting gentle shadows across the worn linoleum where 3 generations of her family had shared meals, arguments, and dreams. "Mom, you're going to burn that cake if you don't stop daydreaming," Jessica called from the breakfast table, not looking up from her phone. At 35, Margaret's daughter-in-law had the sharp beauty of someone who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to remind others of it. Her manicured nails clicked against the screen as she scrolled, probably through real estate listings again. She'd been doing that a lot lately. Margaret smiled, though something in Jessica's tone always made her feel like she was walking on thin ice in her own home. "Just thinking about your father-in-law, dear. He always said Sunday mornings were for family time, not phone time." "Well, Harold's not here anymore, is he?" Jessica's voice carried that edge it got when she felt challenged. "And some of us have responsibilities that don't pause for sentimentality." The words stung, but Margaret had learned to let them roll off her back. Ever since Harold passed 2 years ago, leaving the house to her with the understanding that there was room for everyone, the dynamics had shifted. Tom, her son, worked double shifts at the plant and was rarely home. Jessica had gradually taken over more and more of the household decisions, always with that tone that suggested Margaret was lucky to have her help. "You know what we should do?" Jessica suddenly looked up, her eyes bright with mischief. "We should buy a lottery ticket today. Those Sunday drawings are always huge." Margaret laughed, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. "Oh, honey, I don't believe in gambling. Your father-in-law always said that the lottery is a tax on people who can't do math. I know. You've told me 100 times. Jessica stood up, grabbing her purse from the counter. "But come on, live a little. It's just $2. What's the worst that can happen?" There was something infectious about Jessica's enthusiasm when she wanted something. It reminded me of Tom when he was little, begging for just one more bedtime story. "I suppose $2 won't hurt, but you pick the numbers. I wouldn't know where to start." Jessica's grin was triumphant. "Trust me, I've got lucky numbers. We'll go 50-50 on it. Partners." "Partners?" Margaret agreed, though she had no idea what she was agreeing to. An hour later, they stood in the fluorescent-lit convenience store while Jessica carefully filled out the lottery slip. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, marking each number with deliberate precision. "What numbers are you choosing?" Margaret asked, peering over her shoulder. "Oh, just some dates that are important to me. Birth dates, anniversaries, that kind of thing." Margaret noticed Jessica mark down some numbers that didn't look familiar, but she didn't question it. After all, Jessica had her own family history, her own important dates. They paid the clerk. Jessica insisted on paying the full $2 herself, waving away Margaret's offered $1, and walked home with their small slip of paper. "Where should we keep this?" Margaret asked as they entered the house. "I'll hang on to it," Jessica said quickly, tucking the ticket into her wallet. "I'm better at keeping track of important papers." Margaret felt a small flicker of something. Not quite suspicion, but awareness. But she pushed it down. This was just a game, a silly way to spend a Sunday afternoon. What harm could it do? The week passed in its usual rhythm. Margaret tended her small garden, watched her afternoon stories, and cooked dinner for whenever Tom dragged himself home from work. Jessica spent most of her time on her laptop, claiming to work on freelance graphic design projects, though Margaret noticed she seemed to spend a lot of time shopping online. Friday evening, Tom came home earlier than usual, his face gray with exhaustion. At 42, he looked older than his years, with the stooped shoulders of a man carrying invisible weight. "How was your day, son?" Margaret asked, setting a plate of meatloaf in front of him. "Same as always. Work, work, more work." He managed a tired smile. "At least it's Friday. Maybe we can do something fun this weekend." Jessica looked up from her laptop. "Actually, I was thinking we should start looking at smaller places. This house is getting expensive to maintain, and with just the 3 of us..." Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Smaller places? Nothing definite, she said quickly, shooting Tom a look. Just exploring options. Property taxes are going up, and the roof needs work, and... The roof is fine, Margaret said quietly. Your father-in-law and I replaced it 5 years ago. Well, something's always breaking down in old houses, Jessica continued, her voice taking on that reasonable tone that somehow made Margaret feel unreasonable. I'm just thinking about everyone's future. Tom rubbed his temples. Can we not do this tonight? I'm beat. The conversation died, but it left a residue in the air, like smoke from a snuffed candle. Margaret went to bed that night with a strange heaviness in her chest, as if the walls of her own home were closing in. Saturday came and went in blessed normalcy. Margaret worked in her garden, while Jessica disappeared for most of the day, claiming she had errands to run. Tom slept until noon and then spent the afternoon watching baseball, finally looking relaxed for the first time in weeks. Sunday morning brought the familiar ritual of coffee and cake baking. Margaret was humming as she preheated the oven when Jessica burst through the front door, her face flushed and her eyes wild. Turn on the TV, she shouted, fumbling with her phone. Channel 7, now. What's wrong? Margaret asked, alarmed by Jessica's frantic energy. Just turn it on. Margaret reached for the remote with trembling hands, clicking to the local news channel. The lottery drawing was just ending, the numbered balls sitting in their clear container like small white promises. And tonight's winning numbers are 7, 14, 23, 31, 45, and the Powerball number 12, the announcer said with practiced cheer. That's a jackpot worth $50 million. Jessica was staring at her phone, her face pale now instead of flushed. She looked at the TV screen, then back at her phone, then back at the screen again. Jessica, Margaret said softly. What is it? Jessica's voice came out as a whisper. We won. The words didn't make sense at first. Margaret blinked at her daughter-in-law, then at the TV screen where the winning numbers still glowed. We what? We won! Jessica's whisper exploded into a shriek. We won $50 million! Margaret sat down heavily in her recliner, the room spinning slightly. Are you sure? Jessica was already dialing her phone, pacing back and forth across the living room. Tom, you need to come home right now. Don't ask questions, just come home now. Margaret stared at the TV screen, trying to process what was happening. $50 million. It was an impossible number, like the distance to the moon or the number of stars in the sky. Real, but incomprehensible. Where's the ticket? She asked. Jessica patted her purse. Right here, safe and sound. Her eyes were bright with something Margaret had never seen before. Not quite greed, but a hungry sort of excitement that made her look like a stranger. Tom burst through the door 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes and smelling of motor oil. What's the emergency? Jessica said. We won the lottery. She launched herself into his arms, waving her phone. $50 million, Tom. $50 million. Tom looked from Jessica to his mother, his face skeptical. Are you serious right now? Jessica grabbed the lottery ticket from her purse, comparing it to the numbers on her phone screen. Look, 7, 14, 23, 31, 45, and 12. Every single number matches. Margaret watched her son's face transform as the reality sunk in. The exhaustion melted away, replaced by wonder, then disbelief, then a joy so pure that it brought tears to her eyes. Mom, he said, turning to her. Mom, do you realize what this means? But before Margaret could answer, Jessica stepped between them, clutching the ticket to her chest. It means we never have to worry about money again. It means we can finally live the life we deserve. Something in the way Jessica said "we" made Margaret's stomach tighten, but she pushed the feeling away. This was a moment for celebration, not suspicion. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, internet searches about lottery procedures, and wild discussions about what they would do with the money. Tom talked about quitting his job, about maybe starting his own business. Margaret found herself dreaming about things she'd given up long ago. Travel, maybe, or fixing up the house properly. But Jessica's dreams were different. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, already looking at luxury cars and vacation homes. "We should get financial advisors," she said, "and maybe a lawyer. Rich people always have lawyers." "We're not rich yet," Margaret pointed out gently. "We haven't even claimed the prize." Jessica looked up from her screen, and for a moment, her expression was unreadable. "Of course, we'll go first thing Monday morning." That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning. $50 million. Even after taxes, it would be more money than she'd ever dreamed of. She could finally stop worrying about the utility bills, about whether her small Social Security check would stretch to the end of the month. She could help Tom, maybe set aside money for grandchildren she hoped would come someday. But something felt wrong, like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect song. She couldn't put her finger on what it was, but it kept her awake until the early hours of morning. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling. Jessica was up early, already dressed in her best outfit, the navy blue suit she wore to important meetings. "Ready for the big day?" she asked Margaret over coffee. "I suppose so, though I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be ready for." Jessica laughed, but it sounded forced. "We're about to become millionaires, Mom. That's not something that happens every day." Margaret noticed Jessica had stopped calling her Margaret and started using Mom more frequently. It should have felt warmer, but somehow it didn't. They drove to the state lottery office in Jessica's car, the precious ticket safely tucked in Jessica's purse. Margaret stared out the window at the familiar streets of her town, wondering if they would look different when she came back as a millionaire. The lottery office was smaller than Margaret had expected, just a suite of rooms in a generic office building. The staff, however, treated them like royalty the moment Jessica presented the winning ticket. "Congratulations," said Ms. Rodriguez, the claims processor. "This is quite exciting. Now, I'll need to see identification from the ticket holder, and we'll need to verify the ticket's authenticity, though I can already tell you it looks legitimate." Jessica reached for her wallet, then paused. "Actually, we're both on the ticket. We bought it together." Ms. Rodriguez looked confused. "I'm sorry, but lottery tickets can only be claimed by the person whose name is on them. Whose name should we use for the claim?" Margaret looked at Jessica, expecting her to explain their partnership arrangement. But Jessica was staring at the ticket in the processor's hands, her face pale. "What do you mean, whose name is on the ticket?" Margaret asked. Ms. Rodriguez held up the ticket, pointing to a section Margaret had never noticed. "Every lottery ticket has to have a name written on the back for security purposes. This one says," she squinted at the writing, "Jessica Chen." The air in the small office seemed to thicken. Margaret turned to Jessica, waiting for an explanation, but Jessica was staring at the floor. I filled it out," Jessica said quietly. "You asked me to handle the ticket, so I put my name down." "But we're partners," Margaret said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "You said we were going 50-50. Jessica finally looked up, and Margaret saw something in her eyes she'd never seen before. Not just discomfort, but calculation. "Well, technically, the ticket is in my name, but of course we'll share, we're family." Miss Rodriguez cleared her throat diplomatically. "I'm afraid the state can only recognize the legal owner of the ticket, which is the person whose name appears on it. However, what you do with the winnings after that is entirely up to you." Margaret felt the world tilting slightly, like she was on a ship in rough seas. "Jessica, surely you're going to—" "Of course," Jessica said quickly. Too quickly. "We'll work it all out. Let's just focus on claiming the prize first." The rest of the appointment passed in a haze. Jessica signed papers, provided identification, chose the lump sum payment option that would give them $30 million after taxes. Margaret sat silent in her chair, watching her daughter-in-law become a millionaire. The drive home was quiet, except for the radio and the sound of rain on the windshield. Margaret stared out the window, trying to process what had happened. Legally, Jessica owned the entire jackpot, but surely she wouldn't actually keep it all. They were family. They had an agreement. "So," Margaret said finally, When do you think we should tell Tom? Jessica's hands tightened on the steering wheel. About what? About the name situation. About how we're going to split things. Jessica was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if she'd heard the question. Finally, she said, "I've been thinking about that." And? Well, the thing is, Margaret, Jessica's voice took on that reasonable tone again. I mean, I did pick all the numbers. They were my lucky numbers, my special dates. And technically, I did pay for the ticket. Margaret's chest tightened. But we agreed. I know what we said, but that was when it was just a silly game. This is real money now. Life-changing money. Jessica's voice was gaining strength, as if she was convincing herself as much as Margaret. And the truth is, I've been supporting this household for 2 years now. My freelance work pays most of the bills, while Tom barely makes enough to cover groceries. That's not true, Margaret said quietly. Isn't it? When's the last time your Social Security check covered anything more than your personal expenses? When's the last time Tom brought home enough to pay the mortgage? Each word felt like a small slap. Margaret knew Jessica was exaggerating, but there were threads of truth in what she was saying, and those threads hurt. Besides, I'm not going to throw you out on the street. We're family. But I think we need to be realistic about what this money means and who it belongs to. They pulled into the driveway of the house that had been Margaret's home for 45 years. Jessica turned off the engine and sat for a moment staring at the steering wheel. I know this is hard to understand, she said, her voice softer now. But this is our chance to finally have the life we deserve. Tom and I can pay off all our debts, maybe get a bigger place, start fresh. And you'll be taken care of, I promise. Margaret unbuckled her seatbelt with trembling fingers. Taken care of how? Well, we'll make sure you're comfortable. Maybe we can find you a nice little apartment, something easier to maintain. Or there are some really lovely senior communities. You want to put me in a home. Not a home, Mom, just somewhere that makes more sense for everyone. Margaret got out of the car without another word and walked into her house. Behind her, she heard Jessica calling her name, but she didn't stop. She went straight to her bedroom and closed the door. Sitting on the edge of the bed she'd shared with Harold for 30 years, Margaret tried to understand what had just happened. An hour ago, she'd been a lottery winner. Now, she was apparently a burden to be managed. She heard Jessica and Tom talking in the living room, their voices rising and falling in urgent conversation. She couldn't make out the words, but she could guess what was being said. Jessica would explain about the ticket, about the legal technicalities. She would make it sound reasonable, inevitable, and Tom, tired from years of financial stress, would probably agree. Margaret was right. When Tom knocked on her bedroom door an hour later, his face was a map of conflicted emotions. Mom, can we talk? She let him in, and they sat together on the bed, like they used to, when he was a child and needed comfort after a nightmare. Jessica explained about the ticket. He said carefully. Did she? Mom, I know this isn't what we expected, but legally, your wife owns $50 million that we won together. Morally, Tom, what do you think is right? Tom's face crumpled. I don't know, Mom. I'm so tired of being broke all the time. I'm tired of working 60 hours a week and still not having enough. When Jessica told me about the money, for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Margaret reached over and took her son's work-worn hand in hers. I understand, sweetheart. I do. But what kind of people do we want to be? Jessica says she'll take care of you. She says we can find you a nice place, somewhere you don't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep. This is my home, Tom. The home your father and I built together. I know, but maybe it's time for changes, for all of us. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. She saw Harold's eyes, but also something that hadn't been there before. Desperation, maybe, or just exhaustion that ran so deep it had changed who he was. "What does Jessica plan to do with $30 million?" she asked. Tom's face brightened slightly. "She has all these ideas, investment properties, maybe a business. She wants to travel, see the world. And Mom, she wants to set aside money for kids, our kids. We could finally afford to start a family." Margaret felt a stab of pain so sharp she nearly gasped. Grandchildren. The one dream she'd held onto through all the lean years, all the small indignities of growing old. Jessica was offering Tom grandchildren, and all it would cost was his mother's home and dignity. "When do you plan to move?" she asked quietly. Tom looked away. "Jessica found a house. It's in Riverside, about an hour from here. 5 bedrooms, swimming pool. It's beautiful, Mom." An hour away. Far enough that Sunday dinners would become occasional visits, then holiday obligations, then memories. "And me. There's a senior community about 10 minutes from the new house. Jessica looked it up on mine. It has activities and meal plans, and we could visit all the time." Margaret nodded slowly. The future was crystallizing with horrible clarity. Jessica would move Tom away from everything familiar, surround him with luxury bought with stolen dreams, and gradually, Margaret would fade from their lives, like an old photograph left in the sun. "I see." Tom seemed to take her calmness as acceptance. "Jessica says we could have everything moved within the month. The house here would sell quickly. It's in a good neighborhood." "You're selling my house." "We're selling our house, Mom. Legally, you inherited it, but you can't afford the taxes and upkeep. This way, you get your share of the sale, and Jessica gets to use the lottery money for investments. Everyone wins. Everyone wins." Margaret looked at her son, this man she'd raised from a baby, and realized she was looking at a stranger. Tom had always been weak. She'd known that about him since he was small. He took the path of least resistance, avoided confrontation, and let stronger personalities make decisions for him. She'd hoped marriage would strengthen him, but Jessica had simply become another current carrying him along. "I need some time to think," she said. Tom leaned over and kissed her forehead. "I know it's a lot of changes, but Mom, we're going to be rich, really rich. We'll never have to worry about money again." After he left, Margaret sat alone in her bedroom as shadows lengthened across the floor. She thought about Harold, about the dreams they'd shared, about the life they'd built in this house. She thought about Jessica's lucky numbers and wondered whose important dates they really were. Then she got up, walked to the old secretary desk in the corner, and pulled out a manila folder marked Important Papers. Inside were birth certificates, insurance policies, tax returns, and other documents accumulated over a lifetime. She looked through them methodically until she found what she was looking for: Jessica's birth certificate, which Margaret had helped her obtain when she'd applied for a passport 2 years ago. Jessica Marie Chen, born July 14th, 1989. Margaret stared at the date, then walked to the kitchen where her calendar hung by the refrigerator. July 14th, 7:14. She thought about the winning lottery numbers: 7, 14, 23, 31, 45, 12. 7 and 14 were obvious now, but what about the others? Margaret returned to her folder and pulled out the marriage certificate for Tom and Jessica. They'd married on March 31st, 2018, 3/31, and Jessica had been born in 1989, 45 years after 1944, Harold's birth year. The number 12 was trickier, but as Margaret thought about it, she remembered Jessica mentioning her parents' anniversary was in December 12th specifically, because Jessica had joked about the repetition of numbers. Every single winning number was connected to Jessica's personal history, not some random selection. Jessica hadn't chosen lucky numbers for a whim. She'd chosen them deliberately, systematically, as if she'd been planning this for a long time. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, her heart pounding. This hadn't been a spontaneous game between partners. This had been calculated, planned, executed. Jessica had been buying lottery tickets with her personal numbers, maybe for weeks or months, waiting for a win. The Sunday morning suggestion, the insistence on paying for the ticket herself, the casual agreement to partnership, it had all been performance. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Margaret could confront Jessica directly, but that would accomplish nothing. Jessica would deny it, claim the number similarity was coincidence, maybe even accuse Margaret of being a jealous old woman trying to steal money that didn't belong to her. She could tell Tom, but Tom had already made his choice. The promise of wealth and grandchildren had seduced him completely. He would take Jessica's side, probably convince himself that his mother was suffering from age-related paranoia. Margaret could fight this legally, but she had no proof of partnership beyond her word against Jessica's. And she was a 72-year-old widow going up against a young couple with $30 million to spend on lawyers. As she sat in her quiet kitchen, watching the last light fade from the windows, Margaret realized she was completely alone. Her son had been bought, her home was being sold, and her future was being decided by someone who had never loved her. But Margaret hadn't survived 72 years, a difficult marriage, widowhood, and 2 years of subtle psychological warfare from her daughter-in-law by giving up easily. If Jessica wanted to play games, Margaret would play games too. The next morning, Jessica emerged from the master bedroom with the brightness of someone who'd slept well on silk sheets stuffed with money. She hummed as she made coffee, occasionally pausing to look at her phone and smile. "Good morning, Mom," she said cheerfully. "Sleep well?" "Well enough," she replied. "Jessica, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." Jessica's humming stopped. "Oh? About what specifically?" "About the lottery money belonging to you. About moving me to a senior community." Jessica turned to face her, wariness creeping into her expression. "And?" "You're right." The words hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful and fragile and impossible. What?" "You're right," Margaret repeated calmly. "The ticket is in your name. You chose the numbers. You paid for it. Legally and morally, the money is yours." Jessica's face went through a complicated series of expressions: surprise, suspicion, relief, and finally, triumph. Well, yes. I'm glad you understand." "I do. And I think your idea about the senior community is practical too. This house is too big for me, and the maintenance is becoming overwhelming." "Really?" Jessica's voice was bright with disbelief. "You're okay with all this?" "I'm not. I'm a practical woman, Jessica. I can see when I'm outmatched. I just have one small request." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of request?" "I'd like to stay here until you close on your new house. Just a few more weeks in the place where I raised my family. After that, I'll go quietly wherever you think is best." Jessica relaxed, probably thinking she'd won more completely than she dared hope. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. We're not monsters." "I know you're not, dear. You're just people who've been given an extraordinary opportunity." "Exactly." Jessica's smile was radiant now. "I'm so glad you understand. Tom was worried you'd be difficult about this." "Tom doesn't know his mother very well if he thought I'd be difficult about anything." That was the first lie Margaret had told in the conversation, but I doubted it would be the last. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret played her role perfectly. She was gracious about the house showings, cooperative about packing her belongings, and enthusiastic about the brochures Jessica brought her from various senior living facilities. She asked intelligent questions about Jessica's investment plans and complimented her on her financial acumen. Jessica, basking in what she thought was total victory, became almost generous. She promised Margaret a comfortable allowance from the lottery winnings, talked about family visits and holiday gatherings, and even suggested they might take a cruise together once Margaret was settled in her new home. Margaret smiled and nodded and said all the right things. But in the quiet hours when Jessica and Tom were out shopping for furniture for their new mansion, Margaret was busy. She started with the local newspaper, placing a small classified ad in the personal section. It read, JC, your lucky numbers were 7, 14, 23, 31, 45, 12. Congratulations on your big win. Hope it was worth it. Someone who knows. The ad ran for 3 days. Margaret watched Jessica carefully during that time, looking for signs of nervousness or guilt. But Jessica seemed obliviously happy. Next, Margaret called the state lottery office with a question about ticket purchasing procedures. I'm writing an article for my church newsletter about lottery security, she told the helpful clerk. Can you tell me how long people typically keep their losing tickets before throwing them away? Oh, that varies, the clerk said. But we recommend people keep all their tickets for at least 180 days, just in case there are any discrepancies with the drawings. And do you keep records of which numbers are purchased where? Absolutely. Every ticket is tracked from the moment it's printed to the moment it's claimed or expires. How interesting. So if someone wanted to, they could find out if the same person had been playing the same numbers for months? Well, that information wouldn't be public, of course. But yes, we maintain those records. Margaret thanked the clerk and hung up. Then she called a number she'd found in the phone book. Pearson Investigations, answered a gravelly voice. Mr. Pearson, my name is Margaret Walsh. I'd like to hire you to look into some lottery ticket purchases. 3 days later, Margaret met Mr. Pearson at a diner across town. He was a thin man in his 60s with intelligent eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd spent years watching other people's secrets unfold. Mrs. Walsh, what I found is very interesting, he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. Your daughter-in-law has been playing those exact same numbers every week for the past 6 months. Same convenience store, same day of the week, same number combination. Margaret opened the folder and looked at photocopies of lottery tickets, all bearing Jessica's name and the same 6 numbers that had won them $50 million. She's been systematic about it, Pearson continued. Never missed a week, always bought the ticket on Saturday afternoon. The store clerk remembers her because she was very particular about filling out the numbers herself. Can you prove she never mentioned a partnership to anyone? I interviewed the clerk, the store manager, and 2 regular customers who were there on various Saturdays. Nobody ever saw her with an elderly woman, and she never mentioned sharing the ticket with anyone. Margaret nodded, looking through the documentation. It was exactly what she'd suspected. But having proof felt different, more real, more final. There's something else, Pearson said. I did some background checking on your daughter-in-law. She's been in financial trouble for the past year. Credit cards maxed out, behind on car payments, her freelance business barely breaking even. She needed this money badly. Badly enough to steal it? That's for you to decide, Mrs. Walsh. But people have done worse things for a lot less money. Margaret paid Pearson his fee and took the folder home. That evening, while Jessica and Tom were out looking at furniture, she made copies of everything and hid the originals in her safety deposit box at the bank. Then she sat down and wrote a letter. The letter was addressed to the State Attorney General's office, specifically to their Fraud Investigation Division. In it, Margaret detailed the circumstances of the lottery ticket purchase, Jessica's pattern of playing the same numbers for months, and the false representation of partnership that had induced Margaret to participate in what she thought was a shared endeavor. She didn't mail the letter immediately. Instead, she kept it on her bedside table, like a loaded gun she wasn't quite ready to fire. The next morning brought unexpected news. Jessica bounced into the kitchen, waving her phone like a victory flag. Mom, I just got off the phone with the realtor. We have an offer on the house. Margaret looked up from her coffee. That's wonderful, dear. How much? $250,000. It's slightly below asking, but the buyers want to close quickly. We could be out of here within 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Margaret felt time compressing around her like a vice. 2 weeks to move to some anonymous senior facility while Jessica and Tom started their new life in a mansion bought with stolen money. "That's very fast," she said carefully. "I know, perfect timing, right? Our new house will be ready by then too. Oh, Mom, you should see the pictures Jessica sent me of the senior community. It's like a resort. Swimming pool, exercise classes, bridge tournaments. You're going to love it." I doubt that, but I smiled anyway. "It sounds lovely. Have you chosen which facility?" Jessica sat down at the table, practically vibrating with excitement. "Sunset Manor. It's only 15 minutes from our new place, so we can visit all the time. And the best part, they had a last-minute opening. You can move in next Saturday." Next Saturday. 6 days from now. "My, that is very fast," she said. "I know, it's sudden, but Mom, this is like the universe aligning for us. Everything's falling into place perfectly." Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law's glowing face and thought about the letter upstairs. Jessica had no idea how perfectly things might indeed fall into place. That afternoon, while Jessica was out signing real estate papers, Margaret walked to the post office and mailed the letter to the Attorney General. Then she went to the bank and added a codicil to her will, leaving her portion of the house sale proceeds to a local domestic violence shelter, a charity Jessica had always claimed was unnecessary because women should just leave if they're being abused. She also withdrew $500 in cash and bought a prepaid cell phone from the grocery store. Using the phone, she called the State Lottery Commission's fraud hotline.
"I'd like to report a case of lottery fraud," she told the investigator who answered. "My daughter-in-law has been systematically deceiving me about our supposed partnership in purchasing lottery tickets." The investigator took down all the relevant information and asked Margaret to mail copies of her evidence to their office. She promised to do so immediately. "Ma'am," the investigator said before hanging up, "I have to tell you that lottery fraud cases can be difficult to prosecute. Do you understand that?" "I understand that justice is often difficult," Margaret replied. "But that doesn't mean we should stop pursuing it." The next few days passed in a strange, suspended atmosphere. Jessica and Tom were busy with their new life arrangements, full of excitement and plans. Margaret packed her belongings methodically, as if she really were preparing for a peaceful retirement in a nice facility. But underneath the surface activity, she was waiting. Friday evening, as the family sat down for what would be their last dinner together in the house, Jessica raised her wineglass in a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, "and to family." Margaret raised her water glass. "To getting what we deserve," she replied. Tom, oblivious to any undercurrents, clinked his glass against theirs. "I can't believe this is really happening. 6 months ago, I was sure we'd be bankrupt by Christmas. Now we're millionaires," Jessica finished, her eyes bright with satisfaction. "It's like a fairy tale. Fairy tales usually have a moral," Margaret observed quietly. Jessica laughed. "The moral of our story is that sometimes good things happen to good people." Margaret smiled and said nothing, but she was thinking about different kinds of fairy tales, the original ones, where actions had consequences and justice, however delayed, always arrived. Friday morning came gray and rainy. Jessica had arranged for a moving service to take Margaret's belongings to the storage unit she'd rented, and for a car service to drive Margaret to Sunset Manor. "Everything's handled," Jessica said brightly, checking items off a list on her phone. "The movers will be here at 10, your room at Sunset Manor is ready, and I've already paid your first month's fees." "How generous of you," Margaret said, zipping up her last suitcase. "We're family, Mom. I told you I'd take care of you." Margaret nodded, but she was listening for something else, the sound of cars in the driveway that weren't moving trucks. At 9:47 a.m., she heard it. The knock on the front door was authoritative, official. Jessica frowned and went to answer it, probably expecting the movers early. Instead, she opened the door to find 2 people in dark suits holding badges. "Ms. Jessica Chen," said the taller of the 2, a woman with steel gray hair.
I'm Agent Martinez with the State Attorney General's office, and this is Investigator Thompson. We're here about a lottery fraud complaint that's been filed against you. The color drained from Jessica's face so quickly that Margaret worried she might faint. What? There must be some mistake. May we come in? We have some questions about lottery ticket purchases you made over the past 6 months. Jessica's eyes darted around wildly before landing on Margaret, who was standing in the hallway with her suitcase, watching the scene unfold. Mom, what did you do? Margaret set down her suitcase and walked slowly into the living room. I told the truth, Jessica. It's something I probably should have done sooner. Miss Martinez consulted her notepad. Mrs. Walsh, you're the complainant in this case? I am. Jessica, what's going on? Tom appeared from the kitchen, looking confused. Who are these people? Mr. Walsh, we're investigating allegations that your wife committed fraud in connection with a lottery ticket purchase. Specifically that she misrepresented a partnership arrangement in order to induce your mother to participate in what she believed was a joint lottery ticket purchase. Tom looked from the agents to Jessica to his mother. I don't understand. Investigator Thompson opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Mr. Walsh, were you aware that your wife had been purchasing lottery tickets with the same number combination every week for 6 months prior to the winning draw? What? No, that's not. Jessica said it was just a random thing, a Sunday morning game. According to our investigation, Ms. Chen purchased tickets with the numbers 7, 14, 23, 31, 45, and 12 every Saturday afternoon at Morton's convenience store for 26 consecutive weeks. The store clerk has confirmed this pattern.
Jessica finally found her voice. That doesn't prove anything. So what if I played the same numbers? People do that all the time. You're right, Agent Martinez said calmly. Playing the same numbers isn't illegal. What is potentially illegal is representing to another person that they are entering into a partnership when you have no intention of honoring that partnership. But we are partners. Jessica's voice was rising. Tell them, Mom. Tell them we agreed to split the money. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law, this woman who had systematically planned to steal her dreams and then tried to convince her she should be grateful for the theft. Jessica, Margaret said quietly, when you filled out that lottery ticket, whose name did you put on it? Whose name I put on it? Mine. But that was just because, and when you chose those numbers, whose important dates were they? Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Margaret turned to the investigators. The winning numbers were July 14th, Jessica's birthday, March 31st, her wedding date, 1989, the year she was born, 45, the number of years between her birth and my late husband's birth year, and 12, the day of her parents' anniversary. Every single number was connected to Jessica's personal history, not ours together. Agent Martinez made notes while Jessica stared at Margaret with something approaching horror. Furthermore, Margaret continued, Jessica paid for the ticket herself, refused my offer to contribute, and kept the ticket in her personal possession. When we arrived at the lottery office, she was surprised to learn that only the name on the ticket could claim the prize. If this had been a genuine partnership, wouldn't she have known to put both our names on it? Tom sank into a chair, his face gray. Jessica, is this true? Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand. None of you understand. I've been carrying this family for 2 years. I've been paying bills while Tom barely makes minimum wage. I've been listening to Margaret talk about her dead husband and her precious house while we go deeper into debt every month. I deserved that money. I earned it. The room fell silent except for the sound of Jessica's ragged breathing. So you admit there was no genuine partnership? Agent Martinez asked. Jessica looked around the room at the faces staring at her. Tom's shock, the investigator's professional interest, and Margaret's sad certainty. I need a lawyer, she whispered. That's your right. In the meantime, we'll need you to come with us for questioning. The Lottery Commission is also freezing the winnings pending the outcome of this investigation. Freezing the winnings? Tom stood up suddenly. What does that mean?
It means that until this matter is resolved, no one can access the lottery money. If fraud is established, the rightful ownership of the ticket will need to be determined by the courts. Jessica turned to Margaret, and for a moment, her mask of sophisticated indifference slipped completely away. Underneath was something desperate and ugly. You vindicated old witch. You couldn't stand that I was finally going to have something good in my life. You couldn't stand that Tom chose me over you. Margaret looked at this woman who had lived in her house, eaten her food, and slowly poisoned her relationship with her son, and felt something unexpected. Pity. Jessica, she said gently, I never tried to compete with you for Tom's love. There was room for both of us in his life, but you couldn't see it that way. You had to have everything, even things that didn't belong to you. The money is mine. I bought the ticket.
With numbers you'd been playing for months, hoping for exactly this outcome. You planned this, Jessica. You planned to let me think we were partners, and then you planned to take everything for yourself. Agent Martinez stepped forward. Miss Chen, we really do need you to come with us now. As Jessica was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Margaret one last time. You'll never see a penny of that money now. The lawyers will eat it all up. You've destroyed it for everyone. Margaret watched through the front window as the car carrying Jessica disappeared down the street. Then she turned to find Tom staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Mom, he said slowly, what have you done? I've told the truth, son. Nothing more, nothing less. But the money was never ours to begin with, Tom. It was stolen from me through lies and manipulation. I just made sure the truth came to light. Tom ran his hands through his hair, looking older than his 42 years. Do you have any idea what you've just cost us? Even if you win in court, the legal fees alone will eat up most of the winnings. We could have been millionaires, Mom. We could have had everything. Margaret sat down in her recliner, suddenly feeling every one of her 72 years. Tom, what kind of people would we have been if we'd built our happiness on stolen money? We would have been rich people. We would have been thieves. Tom stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you threw away our one chance at real financial security because of some principle. And I can't believe you would choose money over what's right. Right? Tom's voice cracked. Mom, I'm 42 years old, and I've been broke my entire adult life. I work 60 hours a week at a job that's killing me slowly, and I still can't afford to give my wife the life she deserves. When that lottery money came along, it felt like a miracle. It felt like maybe, for once, something good was going to happen to us. Margaret's heart broke a little at the pain in her son's voice. Something good did happen, Tom. You found out what kind of person you married before you made any irreversible decisions. What's that supposed to mean? It means that Jessica was willing to steal from your mother and then convince you to help her hide it. What do you think she would have done to you once she had $30 million and no more use for you? Tom's face went pale. That's not... Jessica loves me. Jessica loves what you can give her. There's a difference. The moving truck chose that moment to arrive, its diesel engine rumbling in the driveway. The movers knocked on the door, clipboards in hand, ready to take Margaret's possessions to storage. Tom answered the door and explained that there had been a change of plans. The movers left, probably grateful not to have to work in the rain. So what happens now? Tom asked when they were alone again. Now we wait. The investigation will take time, probably months. The courts will have to determine the rightful ownership of the ticket. And in the meantime, I'm still your mother, and this is still my house, and you're still my son. Nothing about that has changed. Tom sat down across from her, his head in his hands. Everything has changed, Mom. My wife is in jail, my marriage is probably over, and we're back to being broke. How has nothing changed? Margaret got up and went to the kitchen, returning with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Tom and sat back down. Tom, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with your baseball? Tom looked up, confused by the apparent change of subject. Yeah, I remember. You were terrified to tell her what you'd done.
You wanted to just run away and hope she wouldn't figure out it was you. But I made you go over there and confess. I did. And what happened?
She was angry at first, but then she said she respected me for telling the truth. She let me work off the cost of the window by doing yard work for her. Margaret nodded. And what did you learn from that? Tom was quiet for a long moment. That running away from problems doesn't make them go away, and that people respect you more when you face the consequences of your actions. That's right. And what have I just done, Tom? Understanding dawned slowly in Tom's eyes. You faced the consequences of what Jessica did. I faced the truth of what Jessica did, just like I taught you to do when you were 8 years old. Tom drank his coffee in silence, staring out the window at the rain. Finally, he said, I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Mom. Margaret's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. I understand, son, but I hope someday you'll see that I did this because I love you, not in spite of it. How is destroying my marriage and my financial future an act of love? Because Jessica was destroying you, slowly, quietly, but surely. She was turning you into someone who would choose money over integrity, who would throw his own mother out of her home for the promise of wealth. That's not the man your father and I raised. Tom's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down with shaking hands. Maybe the man you raised wasn't strong enough for the real world. Or maybe the real world convinced you that strength meant compromising your values instead of defending them. They sat in silence as the rain continued to fall outside. Margaret knew that the next few months would be difficult. The legal battle would be exhausting, expensive, and public. Tom might never forgive her. The money, even if she won the right to it, would be diminished by legal fees. But Margaret was wrong about one thing. Margaret would see that money, at least part of it. More importantly, she would see justice done. 6 months later, Margaret stood in another government office, this time the courthouse where the final hearing in the case of Walsh v. Chen was being concluded. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, looked over her reading glasses at the assembled parties. Jessica sat at the defendant's table with her lawyer, looking thin and brittle. Tom sat in the gallery behind Margaret, their relationship still strained, but slowly healing. After reviewing all the evidence presented, the judge said, "This court finds that Ms. Chen did indeed engage in fraudulent misrepresentation in her dealings with Mrs. Walsh. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of deceptive behavior designed to induce Mrs. Walsh to believe she was entering into a legitimate partnership arrangement." Jessica's face remained impassive, but her lawyer spoke something in her ear that made her shoulders slump. "However," the judge continued, "this court also finds that Ms. Chen's fraudulent conduct has created a liability to Mrs. Walsh for damages. This court orders Ms. Chen to pay Mrs. Walsh the sum of $15 million, half of the after-tax lottery winnings, as compensation for the partnership arrangement she falsely represented." Jessica shot to her feet. "Your Honor, that's not fair. I bought the ticket." The judge fixed her with a cold stare. "Miss Chen, you induced Mrs. Walsh to believe she was your partner through deliberate deception. In equity, if not in law, she became entitled to the benefits of that partnership. You cannot profit from your own fraud." Margaret felt Tom's hand on her shoulder and looked back to see him smiling for the first time in months. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court is ordering Miss Chen to pay all legal costs associated with this case, as her fraudulent conduct necessitated this litigation." An hour later, Margaret stood on the courthouse steps with Tom, breathing the crisp autumn air. The legal battle was over, but the real healing was just beginning. "So what are you going to do with $15 million? Tom asked. Margaret smiled. "First, I'm going to pay off your mortgage. Then I'm going to set up college funds for those grandchildren I'm still hoping for. And then I'm going to fix the roof on our house, the one that never actually needed fixing in the first place." Tom laughed, and it was the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him in almost a year. "What about Jessica?" Margaret looked back at the courthouse.
where Jessica was presumably dealing with the reality of having $15 million instead of 30, and a criminal record instead of a clean slate. Jessica will have to figure out her own path forward. I hope she learns something from all this, but that's not my responsibility anymore. Do you think she will? Learn something. Margaret considered the question seriously. I think Jessica has spent so long focusing on what she thought she deserved that she forgot to think about what she actually earned. Maybe losing half of everything will teach her the difference. They walked to Margaret's old sedan. She decided that $15 million didn't mean she needed to change everything about her life. "Mom," said Tom as they reached the car, "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything, son." "Yes, I do. I chose money over family. I chose convenience over integrity. And when you tried to show me the right path, I got angry at you instead of grateful." Margaret turned to face her son fully. "Tom, you were tired and scared and overwhelmed. Jessica took advantage of that, and I don't blame you for being tempted by what she offered. But you never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself. That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We see who our children really are, even when they've forgotten." As they drove home through the familiar streets of Margaret's neighborhood, Tom asked, "Do you think we can really go back to the way things were?" Margaret smiled, thinking of the empty master bedroom that would need to be converted back to her sewing room, the kitchen table that would once again be set for Sunday dinners, and the future that stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story. "No," she said, "we can't go back. But we can go forward, and that's even better." That evening, Margaret sat in her garden as the sun set behind the trees Harold had planted 30 years ago. The $15 million was real. The check was already in her bank account, but it felt less important than other things. The sound of Tom's voice as he called his friends to tell them he was quitting his second job, the way he'd hugged her on the courthouse steps, the knowledge that she'd fought for what was right and won. She thought about Jessica, probably sitting in some expensive apartment, staring at her own $15 million check and wondering how it had all gone so wrong. Margaret hoped that someday Jessica would understand that she could have had everything: love, family, security, if she'd just been willing to share it. But that was Jessica's story to write now. Margaret's story was different. It was about a woman who'd been tested late in life and discovered she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had imagined. It was about the difference between what we deserve and what we earn, and the courage required to insist on the distinction. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret smiled and went inside to make dinner for her son. Tomorrow, she would start planning how to use her unexpected wealth to help others. Tonight, she would simply enjoy the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, if you're patient enough and brave enough, justice does prevail. The numbers, as it turned out, didn't lie, but more importantly, neither did the truth. In the end, that made all the difference.